Hi, this is Jeff Carpenter, and I'm here with David Gilardi. We're on the technical evangelist team here at DataStax, and we'd like to talk to you about the KillrVideo reference application. Now, in a prior video, we chatted with Luke Tillman about the history of KillrVideo, and then we talked about where you and I, David, are taking it moving forward. I want to talk a little bit with you about what you've been doing with the Java implementation of KillrVideo. Now, there was a prior Java implementation of the service APIs, the service layer for KillrVideo, that our colleague Juan did. So that was a pre-existing Java implementation, and that was based on his Achilles object mapper, which has kind of grown into its own framework.
Yeah.
And then you did some work to transition that to using the DataStax driver, the DSE driver, DataStax Enterprise driver specifically. So can you talk about your goals for that particular implementation of that Java layer of KillrVideo?
Yeah, so as you just mentioned, like one of the goals, the Achilles version used the Cassandra driver, right? It was using the Cassandra specific driver.
Right.
And one of the goals we have for the KillrVideo project in general, not just the driver project, is to get everything up on the DSE versions of the drivers.
Because?
So part of that is because we are moving the KillrVideo app forward to start exercising a lot of the newer DSE features, like in DSE 5.1 and everything that are specific to the DSE driver. So part of the goal there with moving the, creating our own version or forking off and then kind of porting our version into the DSE version is to have a DSE core driver version of the Java implementation.
Right. Okay, so that was the project.
Yeah.
Port to DSE driver. What parts of that were the most interesting to you to work on?
Well, let's see. There was actually all sorts of it. Putting aside the Java version just for a moment, and we did talk about this a little bit in some of the other videos, right? The microservice architecture, some of that piece that we mentioned with Luke, getting into that and getting into how that worked with Docker and stuff, that was actually quite interesting. That was one of the neatest parts. But in the core Java code, right, one of the most interesting parts by far was the asynchronous pieces, because in all frankness and that kind of deal, I did not come into this with a ton of asynchronous programming knowledge. That just wasn't something that I had worked on before. So coming into the project and then having to look at that between not only the Java version but the C# version, the Node.js version, and kind of like figure out how all that worked. How do I put this together? That was definitely one of the most interesting pieces. And as a matter of fact, too, I was specifically trying to follow as closely as I could to the DataStax documentation that we provide on actually how to do all of this. So it was just a big learning experience. So even though there were a ton of really interesting aspects, I think the asynchronous piece was.
So you've gone a couple places there that I want to dig in and explore a little deeper. One of them is that polyglot language perspective, where you're actually working on multiple language implementations of the same services at the same time. Yeah. So did that kind of inform, like you were learning one thing from one language, which you were able then to bring into the other language implementation, or how did that work?
Yeah, absolutely. Matter of fact, Luke Tillman had he's the one who punched the Node.js version out and the C# version actually. And so it was kind of nice because I was able to go to those, and this is for anybody who's looking at any of the versions that we have out there. I highly recommend go take a look at some of the other versions, because I was able to use what he had done in both C# and Node.js to help me kind of inform and guide in certain directions that I went, especially the asynchronous programming piece, right? Because one of the goals we had was to make sure that all the transactions, everything, it was all fully asynchronous and that was working properly and such. So I was able to use what he had there as a guide, because the Java implementation, like when you start getting into, at least as far as I'm concerned, like when you compare, say, a completable feature and the way that you do certain, asynchronous programming in Java compared to the implementations I saw in Node.js and C#, it's a little more complex in the Java one. It's a lot more straightforward in the other ones, right?
That syntax is a little bit more tricky.
Yeah. So that was something that I had to really go through and figure out. So yes, I was able to use the other versions in that case, again, as a nice reference point. But then the other part of it too, from like an insight standpoint, is now being able to look at the driver across the board, look at it for all these different languages and see kind of like maybe subtle nuances and differences. And something you mentioned about the polyglot piece of it is, in the organization that I came from before I came to DataStax, right, it was absolutely normal through acquisitions or through anything for us to have multiple applications, not just all in Java or not just all in C#. They were all in, an amalgam of all of these, right? And so it was kind of normal for anyone who was on our engineering team to have to be full stack and have to know multiple languages and how to do this across the board. So that kind of that ended up kind of being one of the directions is we wanted to get everything to parity, right? So we have the versions that had similarities between them. So someone could look at any one of them, see how we're doing it in the DSC driver across the board, right? And in that way, it would help those developers who might be in that situation where they do have multiple languages they have to worry about, that they can, now they can reference multiple reference apps as well that are going to be similar in build, how they're built.
That's excellent. One of the things that calls out to me is that our driver team has done an excellent job of having parity across the different drivers, the different language drivers. There doesn't tend to be one that's way ahead of another. I feel by and large they are across the board offering the same capabilities with the same kind of paradigms for interaction, which makes it possible for you to do what you're doing and having the applications work the same.
Yeah.
Because you're right, it's not as if we always have that luxury on a
Not
project of being able to say all the services are going to be in this language on top of this platform. I mean, even if you have uniformity in the infrastructure that you're using, it's inevitable that one team is going to do a version upgrade of this or that library before the other. I mean, we live in a world in which you're going to have to adapt to languages, infrastructures, etc., from project to project or even service to service.
Yeah.
So that's a great skill set to have. Okay, so I think we've covered that point pretty well.
Yeah.
What I thought is that maybe you want to show us a little bit of what you've been doing with the code itself. Can we do that? Can we look at the source code? Is that?
Can you? Oh, look at. Oh, I think they just did it.
I think we're allowed to do that.
They totally did it.
Now we're in the source.
All right, we're looking at some source. That's great. Okay.
Okay, give us a show.
Well, okay. So, I mean, we're not going to. The whole plan of this is not to dig into the actual source code that you see here. But one of the things I do want to point out is notice these nice comment walls of text, if you will, that I have throughout the code. Just to kind of point out, a lot of the times I was purposefully putting these walls of text in when there was something interesting going on. A lot of times I would be referencing links that maybe reference you to the driver documentation or something along the lines, because there were a lot of scenarios, right, that I came across. One example I give, I thought this one was pretty neat. So you've got, say, prepared statements, right? And you've got the query builder. You've got one way to put queries together, but you also have the mapper, right?
Right.
And one of the things I didn't find out till later, and I just found this to be so interesting, is that when you use the mapper, it actually creates a prepared statement for you underneath the hood, right? So as long as you are reusing that, essentially kind of reconstituting that same query with the mapper, it'll automatically create that prepared statement for you, right? That's really neat. Now that's a little bit different approach than, say, creating prepared statements. Like, this is what I'm actually doing right here. I'm actually creating a prepared statement that I'm going to bind later, right?
Right.
And again, I'm not going to go and show all the detail of that, but it's just a different approach that you can do. And there are cases where I actually had one where I was doing batch inserts, right, where I actually combined one query builder, a prepared statement with a bind later in my batch, along with a query that I built with the mapper. And the way that it works, it actually worked flawlessly. It was really neat. So it was just like little tiny things that I was kind of finding out as I was going through the code. So anyway, the main point of that little diatribe there is look for if you're checking this out, look for those walls of comments and everything. Usually when I put those in there, I was putting them there for very specific reasons, so I can kind of point out something that was done, something that might be interesting, and trying to kind of facilitate a set of examples of different things that might happen in the real world.
Yeah, and I love what you've done with those, because it's really, it's not like most source code that you find. So in that sense, maybe it isn't realistic.
My source code always has comments.
It's particularly well commented, and the quality of, you are doing a little bit of teaching or instruction there about what it is that you're doing. It's not just, I got this cookie cutter cut and paste stuff that I grabbed from the driver manual. It's like there's actual thought behind it, and then you're explaining what you're doing with references back to the documentation. So
You know,
it's great.
and to add to that point, I mentioned kind of earlier that a lot of the times I was purposely, while I was doing this project, I was purposely using the DataStax driver documentation while I was going through for my examples and everything. There are definite parts of code in here. You'll be like, man, he lifted that right off the documentation page. Yes, I did. That's exactly what I did. Because I wanted to kind of an eat your own dog food thing. I was trying to go about it exactly how, right, our documentation team, the driver team and everything was spelling it out for us in the docs.
Right.
So a lot of the times when you see the links I reference, that's what I'm doing. I'm referencing the actual stuff that I was using as a reference to build everything.
So we went pretty far down into the source code here. Why don't you kind of pull us back up to the surface a little bit and give us some context for where we find this code.
Yeah, so let's pop over to the KillrVideo GitHub page. So if you go to github.com/KillrVideo, you can see it up here in my bar. Then that will bring you to the whole KillrVideo project in GitHub. Now notice too, it's not just Java, right? We have all the service implementation, all the microservices, the web UI, all the stuff that we're using to put all this stuff together is right there. And then if you go to KillrVideo Java, right, this is the GitHub repo for the Java version. Feel free to clone it, use it, comment, suggest changes, whatever. Give us your feedback.
Yeah, we are accepting contributions.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate you giving us this little bit of a guided tour of the source code and the GitHub page, David. Look forward to adding more and more features to that KillrVideo implementation. Coming soon, Graph and some other great things.
Yeah, absolutely. We're not done at all. This is an ongoing project. We have, as a matter of fact, you just mentioned, the very next project I'll be working on is some Graph content. So we're going to start pulling Graph and really pushing into some of the DSE 5.1 features.
All right. Well, until next time, thank you for watching.
Thank you.